What happens when a man who has everything tries to humiliate a woman who has nothing left to lose? Tonight's story is about more than just a rude customer and a clever waitress. It's about a multi-billionaire titan of industry, a man used to breaking people, who decided to use his power to mock a server on the grandest public stage he could find. A Michelin star restaurant in the heart of New York City. He chose the wrong woman. He thought his words were a private joke, a venomous whisper she wouldn't understand. But he was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one signing the check. Stick around to hear how a single, perfectly delivered sentence didn't just silence a bully, but caused his entire empire to crumble. The starched white apron felt heavier tonight. Evelyn Vance tied the strings in a crisp, practiced knot, the familiar motion a small anchor in the swirling chaos of a Friday night at Aurelia. From the staff entrance, the dining room was a different world, a glittering expanse of crystal, silver, and hushed, important conversations. Out there, she was just part of the decor, a silent pair of hands tasked with ensuring perfection. In here, in the narrow, steamy corridor, smelling of truffle oil and disinfectant, she was just Evelyn, 26 years old, and carrying the weight of a life she never expected. Each plate she carried felt like a ghost of her past. The seared foie gras with fig reduction. She remembered her father, Arthur Vance, explaining the delicate balance of sweet and savory at a restaurant in Paris when she was 16. The pan-roasted scallops with saffron risotto, a dish she'd once tried to perfect in their sprawling Connecticut kitchen, laughing as she burned the first batch, her mother sneaking a taste and declaring it delicious anyway. Now that kitchen was gone. The house, the laughter, her parents, all gone. A catastrophic business deal, a rival's betrayal, and 2 heart attacks in quick succession had wiped the Vance name from the society pages and replaced it with a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. All that was left was Evelyn, a mountain of her father's residual debts and a bachelor's degree in art history that was about as useful as a chocolate teapot in paying New York rent. So she worked. She served people who lived the life she'd lost, her face a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality. She became an expert at being invisible. She could sense the exact moment a water glass needed refilling, could anticipate the need for a fresh fork before the customer even realized they dropped theirs. She moved with an economy of motion that her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Robert, called peak efficiency. Evelyn called it survival. "Table 7 is getting antsy, Vance," Robert hissed, bustling past her with a stack of menus. "The Sinclairs, he wants his Margot estate decanted for exactly 20 minutes. Not 19, not 21, go." Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. She knew the Sinclairs, old money, a family whose wealth was so ancient it had become a form of quiet, unshakable arrogance. They never looked her in the eye, referring to her only as Miss, in a tone that suggested she was a household appliance. She could handle them. She could handle anyone. An hour bled into the next. The rhythm of the restaurant took over. The low roar of conversation, the clink of glasses, the soft tread of expensive shoes on polished mahogany. Evelyn operated on autopilot, her body moving through the familiar dance of service while her mind drifted. She thought of the final notice from the collections agency tucked in her worn leather wallet, the one for the last of her father's medical bills. It was for $5,000, a sum that felt as insurmountable as Mount Everest. Just as she was clearing the dessert plates from a table of tourists who had marveled at the prices, a new party was seated in her prime section, the coveted corner booth with a panoramic view of Columbus Circle. 3 men. 2 of them looked sharp, dressed in bespoke suits that probably cost more than her annual salary. They flanked the 3rd man, who entered the room not just as a guest, but as a conquering king. Evelyn felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Waiter stood a little straighter. The maitre d', a man who'd seen royalty and presidents, practically bowed. Even the notoriously unflappable Robert seemed to have a sheen of nervous sweat on his brow. She recognized him instantly from the covers of Forbes and Wired. Julian Thorne, the tech wonderkin, the venture capital shark, the self-made billionaire who had built his empire. Apex Ventures, From a dorm room startup into a global behemoth. He was younger than she expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and an air of restless energy. He wore a simple black t-shirt under a tailored blazer, a calculated performance of casual disdain for the very luxury he was indulging in. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe Nautilus, its steel gleam a quiet scream of unimaginable wealth. "Vance, that's your table," Robert whispered, his voice tight. "That's Julian Thorne. Whatever he wants, he gets. Understand? This is the most important table we've had all year." Evelyn's stomach clenched, but not from awe. It was a cold, familiar dread. She had seen men like Julian Thorne up close before, men who saw the world as their personal chessboard and everyone else as pawns. Her father had been one of those pawns, crushed by a man just like this. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and grabbed 3 water glasses. Her face settled into the mask of pleasant, deferential service. It was time to become invisible again. She approached the table, the weight of the apron suddenly feeling like armor. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I start you with some water?" "We have sparkling or still," Evelyn said, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the tension coiling in her gut. Julian Thorne didn't even look up. He was scrolling through something on his phone, his thumb moving in a series of impatient, decisive swipes. One of his companions, a man with silver hair and a weary but intelligent face, nodded. "Still water for me, please." The other, younger and clearly eager to please, echoed the request. Julian finally looked up, not at Evelyn, but through her. He tossed his phone onto the table with a dismissive clatter. "Get me your best bottle of scotch. Something older than you are. Don't bring me a list, just bring me the bottle, and 3 glasses." The command was delivered without a please or any acknowledgement of her existence. He was speaking to a function, not a person. Evelyn simply inclined her head. "Of course, sir." She retreated to the bar, her mind working quickly. The request wasn't just about a drink. It was a power play, a test. Bring something too common, and he'd scoff. Bring something too obscure, and he might accuse her of upselling. She remembered a bottle tucked away in the cellar, a Glenfiddich 40-year-old, a rare and exquisite single malt. It was absurdly expensive, but it was the right kind of statement. When she returned with the bottle on a silver tray, alongside 3 heavy crystal tumblers, Julian was holding court. "The problem with legacy industries," he was saying, his voice a confident baritone that cut through the restaurant's hum, "is that they're run by dinosaurs who think tradition is a substitute for innovation. They're sitting on gold mines they don't know how to excavate. They're waiting for us, for Apex, to show them the way." The younger man, whose name she learned was Kenji, nodded vigorously. "Project Nightingale is the key. Once we acquire Vance Innovate, we'll have the patents we need to dominate the green energy sector for the next 50 years. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Vance Innovate, her father's company, the company that had been his life's work, his passion, stripped for parts and sold off in bankruptcy proceedings 2 years ago. The name was like a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. She had thought it was gone, dissolved into nothing. The idea that Julian Thorne, this paragon of predatory capitalism, was now picking over its bones felt like a desecration. She placed the glasses on the table with a steady hand, her movements fluid and silent. She presented the bottle to Julian. For the first time, he looked directly at her, his blue eyes scanning the label with a flicker of approval. 40 years, wah, he noted, a small, smug smile playing on his lips. "Good choice. You might be competent after all." He gestured for her to pour. As the amber liquid streamed into the glasses, the silver-haired man spoke. He had a faint European accent, his English precise and thoughtful. "The due diligence on the Vance portfolio is complete, Julian?" he asked. "Arthur Vance was a brilliant man, but his record-keeping in his final years was erratic." "Everything is buttoned up, Antoine," Julian replied, waving a dismissive hand. "Our teams went through everything. It's mostly outdated tech, a few interesting but obsolete battery prototypes. The real value is in 2 key patents for energy transference. The rest is just noise. We're basically buying the name and a couple of golden tickets." Evelyn felt a surge of hot anger. Obsolete? Noise? She had spent summers interning at her father's lab. She knew the work he was doing. He was on the verge of something revolutionary, a new kind of organic battery that was decades ahead of its time. He had called it his magnum opus. The idea that Thorne's corporate vultures had sifted through her father's life's work and dismissed it as noise was an insult that cut deeper than any personal slight. She finished pouring and stepped back from the table, her mask of neutrality firmly in place. But behind her eyes a storm was gathering. She was no longer just a waitress serving a table. She was the ghost of Vance Innovate, an invisible witness to the carving up of her own legacy. Julian took a sip of the scotch, swirled it in his glass, and looked at his guest, Antoine Dubois. She recognized that name too. Dubois was a legendary Swiss investor, known for his shrewdness and his deep respect for true innovation. He was old school, a man her father had admired. The fact that he was at a table with a shark like Thorne was disconcerting. Clearly, Thorne was trying to secure funding or a partnership for his acquisition. So, Julian continued, leaning back in the booth, the picture of casual dominance. The deal is simple, Antoine. You come in with us, we acquire the Vance portfolio for pennies on the dollar, and within 5 years, Apex Energy will be a $100 billion company. It's the ground floor of a revolution. Dubois looked thoughtful, swirling his own scotch. I knew Arthur Vance briefly, a true visionary. It's a tragedy what happened to his company. I need to be sure we are honoring his legacy, not just plundering it. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. Honoring his legacy? Antoine, his legacy is a bankrupt company and a pile of debt. We're giving it a new legacy, a profitable one. The words struck Evelyn like a physical blow. She stood a few feet away, by a service station, ostensibly polishing silverware. But she was listening to every word, her knuckles white around a silver fork. The gilded cage of the restaurant, with its soft lighting and expensive liquor, suddenly felt suffocating, a place where men like Julian Thorne could rewrite history and call it business. And she was trapped inside, forced to serve them while they did it. The meal progressed like a carefully orchestrated performance of power. Julian dominated the conversation, painting a grand vision of the future, a future built by him, for him. Kenji provided the fawning chorus of agreement, while Antoine Dubois listened, his expression thoughtful and hard to read. Evelyn moved in and out of their orbit, a silent satellite, refilling water, clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only by the absence of an empty glass or a finished dish. With each course, Julian's arrogance seemed to inflate. He critiqued the wine pairing with the sommelier, not because it was flawed, but to demonstrate that he knew more. He sent back his steak, claiming it was medium rare when he had asked for rare plus, a temperature that barely exists, another small act of dominance to keep the staff off balance. Evelyn handled each request with unnerving calm, her efficiency a silent rebuke to his theatrics. Her composure seemed to irritate him. He started watching her more closely, his gaze sharp and critical. He was a man who expected to see fear or fawning admiration in the eyes of those who served him. Evelyn's cool professional detachment was a blank wall he couldn't seem to breach, and it was beginning to irk him. The main course plates had just been cleared. Evelyn was standing a respectful distance away, waiting for them to signal they were ready for the dessert menu. Julian had just closed another point, leaning forward with a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. The board of the holding company is a formality. They're old fossils, a little nudge, a big check, and they'll roll over, he boasted. Dubois took a slow sip of water. One must be careful with fossils. Sometimes they have more bite than you expect. Julian smirked. Then his eyes flicked over to Evelyn. She was standing perfectly still, her gaze directed at the middle distance, giving them their privacy. But to Julian, her stillness was an affront. She was a nobody, a piece of furniture, and she wasn't showing the proper deference. He saw an opportunity for a bit of casual cruelty, a way to amuse his guests and put the hired help in her place. He leaned towards Antoine Dubois, lowering his voice slightly. He switched to what he thought was their own private channel, a sophisticated code no simple waitress could ever decipher. He spoke in smooth, condescending English. The words, though in a lowered tone, were shaped by a universal edge, mockery. His lips curled into a sneer as he spoke. "Look at her," he began, nodding subtly in Evelyn's direction. "Standing there like a statue. I bet she didn't even finish high school. It's a miracle she can carry a tray without dropping it." To Kenji and Dubois, the meaning was clear. Kenji, ever the sycophant, let out a low, nervous chuckle. Julian wasn't finished. He warmed to his theme, his voice dripping with disdain. "That's the problem with people like her. No ambition, no spark. They exist simply to serve us. It's pathetic, don't you think, Antoine?" The words hung in the air like poison. Antoine Dubois' expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not laugh. He looked from Julian to Evelyn, a flicker of something, discomfort, perhaps disapproval, in his eyes. He was a man of a different generation, one who believed in a certain decorum, even with staff. Julian's casual cruelty was crass, a display of new money insecurity. The venomous whisper had been delivered. Julian Thorne leaned back, a self-satisfied smirk on his face, confident in his wit and his supposed superiority. He had just demonstrated his worldly sophistication while simultaneously dehumanizing the woman standing 10 feet away. He had put on a show for his esteemed guest, reinforcing the vast, unbridgeable chasm between them. The Titans and her, the help. He looked over at Evelyn, expecting to see the same blank, oblivious expression. He was waiting for her to come over and ask about dessert, blissfully unaware of the contempt he had just heaped upon her. But Evelyn was not looking at the middle distance anymore. Her head had turned slightly. Her posture, already perfect, seemed to grow straighter, her spine becoming a rod of steel beneath the simple black uniform. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of silver, the murmur of 100 conversations, seemed to fade into a dull roar in her ears. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a single, crystalline moment where everything hung in the balance. The insult, the witness, the victim. Julian's smirk was frozen on his face. Dubois watched, his eyes narrowed. Evelyn's training, her instinct, her desperation, everything screamed at her to let it go, to swallow the bile rising in her throat, put on her plastic smile, and ask them if they'd care for coffee. Her job, her rent, the $5,000 debt. It all depended on her ability to absorb indignity with a polite nod. But this was different. This wasn't just an insult to her. It was an insult to her parents, to the education they had given her, to the life they had built. He had picked the one weapon he thought was safe, the English language, a language she had mastered on summer holidays in Nice and perfected while studying art in Paris during her semester abroad. He had mocked her intelligence while discussing the destruction of her father's legacy, the anger inside her, a cold and quiet thing she had suppressed for 2 long years, finally ignited. It burned away the fear. It burned away the caution. She took a slow, deliberate breath. She pushed off from the service station, and with a grace that was almost terrifying in its composure, she began to walk toward their table. Each step was silent, precise, and filled with an unspoken purpose. The hunter had become the prey, and he didn't even know it yet. As Evelyn approached the table, Julian Thorne watched her with a lazy, amused expression. He assumed she was coming to take their dessert order, oblivious to the joke he just made at her expense. He prepared to wave her away, to dismiss her with a flick of his wrist. She did not stop at a respectful distance. She walked right up to the edge of the polished mahogany, her shadow falling over the pristine white tablecloth. She didn't look at Julian first. Instead, she fixed her gaze on Antoine Dubois. Her voice when she spoke was not the quiet, deferential tone of a waitress. It was clear, measured, and carried a chillingly formal precision. And she spoke in the very same language Julian had used to belittle her. Flawless, elegant English, delivered with an authority that cut deeper than any insult. "Mr. Dubois," she began, her tone respectful but firm, "my father, Arthur Vance, spoke of you often. He said you were one of the few men in the business world who possessed both great intelligence and true integrity." The words hit like a cannonball fired at point-blank range. Antoine Dubois' eyes widened. He sat bolt upright, his wineglass frozen halfway to his lips. The blood drained from Julian Thorne's face. His smug smirk evaporated, replaced by a mask of stunned, horrified disbelief. Kenji looked back and forth between them, his jaw slack. Evelyn had not only understood him, she had ignored him, addressing his esteemed guest by name and invoking the name of her father, the very man whose company they were plotting to acquire. But she wasn't finished. She now turned her cool, steady gaze directly on Julian Thorne. The full, unshielded force of her intelligence and fury was now aimed at him. Her voice dropped slightly, becoming sharper, more incisive. "As for you, Mr. Thorne," she said, the formal address now sounding like an accusation, "allow me to correct your phrasing. One doesn't say the problem with these people. The proper expression is the problem with this type of person. It's a beginner's mistake. Furthermore, my father ensured I had a first-rate education. I hold a degree in art history from Columbia University with a minor in finance." The words sliced through the air. She had not only understood his insult, she had critiqued its delivery, publicly shredding his pretense of sophistication. She had exposed his clumsy attempt at superiority in front of the very man he was trying to impress. And then, for the final killing blow, she switched her tone once more, this time into crisp, cold English that carried the weight of a verdict. "And I can assure you, sir," she said, her eyes locked on Julian's, "that my ability to carry a tray is entirely independent of my academic qualifications. But I am more than proficient at both." Silence. A profound, echoing silence descended upon the table. The entire world seemed to have shrunk to the few square feet of space between the humiliated billionaire and the vengeful waitress. Julian Thorne looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His face was a pallid canvas of shock, rage, and utter humiliation. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a man who always had the last word, who controlled every room he entered, and he had just been intellectually disarmed and dismantled by his server. It was Antoine Dubois who broke the spell. He slowly placed his glass down on the table, the clink of crystal on wood sounding like a gavel. He looked at Evelyn, but his expression was no longer one of mere surprise. It was one of intense, dawning realization. The name, the face, the fierce intelligence. "My God," Dubois breathed, his voice a whisper of astonishment. "You're Evelyn Vance, Arthur's daughter." Evelyn finally allowed a flicker of emotion to cross her face, a deep, resonant sadness. She gave a single sharp nod. "Yes, Mr. Dubois, I am." The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly annihilated. Julian Thorne was no longer the king of the castle. He was a rude guest who had just committed a fatal error in judgment. And Evelyn Vance was no longer the waitress. She was the rightful heir to the legacy he was trying to buy for pennies, and she had just announced her presence with the force of a thunderclap. The game had changed, and Julian Thorne didn't even know the new rules. The aftermath of Evelyn's retort was a tableau of frozen shock. Julian Thorne's face cycled through a series of emotions. White-hot rage followed by the icy panic of a man whose total control has just been irrevocably shattered. He finally found his voice, a choked, furious rasp. "You're fired," he snarled, not at Evelyn, but at the air itself, as if the pronouncement alone could restore order. He started to look around for the manager. "Get this woman out of here, now!" Robert, the manager, had seen the commotion from across the room and was already rushing over, his face pale with anxiety. "Mr. Thorne, sir, is there a problem?" "A problem?" Julian's voice rose, attracting the attention of nearby tables. "This waitress has been insubordinate. She's harassing my guests. I want her gone." Robert turned to Evelyn, his expression a mixture of fear and pleading. His entire career could be ruined by a complaint from a man like Thorne. "Evelyn, what happened? Go to the back, right now." But before Evelyn could move, Antoine Dubois held up a hand. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that instantly silenced everyone. "She will do no such thing," Dubois said, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. He then turned to Robert. "This young lady is no longer your waitress. She is my guest. Please bring another chair to the table." Julian Thorne stared at Dubois, aghast. "Antoine, what are you doing? She's a member of the staff." "She is the daughter of Arthur Vance," Dubois replied, his voice cold. "And based on what I have just witnessed, she possesses more of her father's intelligence and fire than your teams seem to have uncovered in their due diligence. I would very much like to speak with her." He looked back at Evelyn, his eyes now filled with a deep, compassionate respect. "Miss Vance, please, join us." It was a checkmate. Julian could not object without looking petty and insecure in front of the very investor he was trying to court. Fuming, he slumped back into his seat, his jaw tight with fury. Robert, looking utterly bewildered, scurried off to find a chair. Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second, the years of ingrained servitude warring with the surge of newfound agency. Then, with a deep breath, she untied the strings of her apron, the symbol of her invisibility and servitude. She folded it neatly and placed it on a nearby service tray. The act was simple, but resonant. She was shedding her skin. She sat down in the chair Robert provided, placing herself between Dubois and the seething Julian Thorne. The seating arrangement itself was a statement. She was now a barrier between them. "Miss Vance," Dubois began, his tone now warm and personal, "I am so deeply sorry for your loss and for this unacceptable behavior." He shot a withering glance at Julian. "I had heard that Arthur's family had disappeared after the tragedy. I had no idea." "We didn't disappear, Mr. Dubois," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "We were erased. When you lose everything, people who once called you a friend have a remarkable ability to look right through you." Her words were a direct hit on the world of wealth and power that Julian inhabited, a world where personal value was tied to net worth. "Your father," Dubois continued, his voice full of genuine remorse, "was a brilliant man, a true visionary. I considered him a friend, though we met only a few times. What Julian's firm is proposing, acquiring his life's work, I must admit, it felt predatory. He told me the portfolio was mostly scrap." Julian, unable to stay silent any longer, interjected. "It is mostly scrap," he insisted, his voice strained. "Our top analysts went through every file. A few key patents, that's it. The rest is a dead end. Sentimental value doesn't show up on a balance sheet, Antoine." Evelyn turned her head slowly to look at him. "Your analysts, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice laced with ice, "are accountants. They look for numbers. They wouldn't recognize true innovation if it was coded into the file names. My father wasn't just building a company, he was building the future, a future you are too blind to see." "Oh, really?" Julian scoffed, a sneer returning to his face as he tried to regain control. "And what exactly did my accountants miss, Miss Vance? Some magical invention hidden in a dusty folder?" He meant it as a sarcastic, rhetorical question. He thought he was exposing her as a sentimental girl playing at being a business tycoon. He was wrong. He had just handed her the gun and pointed it at his own foot. "Yes," Evelyn replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial calm that drew both Dubois and Kenji in. "That is exactly what they missed." She leaned forward slightly. The entire restaurant, with its ambient chatter and clinking glasses, faded away. The only thing that mattered was the story she was about to tell. "They missed Project Nightingale," she said. Kenji, the younger associate, blinked. "But we named the acquisition Project Nightingale." Evelyn gave him a pitying smile. "You named your project that. You thought it sounded poetic. You had no idea that it was my father's internal code name for his final, most important work. The work he was pouring all of his resources into before the end." She turned her full attention to Dubois. "Mr. Thorne believes he is acquiring a handful of patents for energy transference. He is mistaken. Those patents were a smokescreen, a project for the shareholders to see. The real work, Project Nightingale, was off the books. It was a prototype for a self-regenerating organic battery. A battery that doesn't store power, but creates it, using ambient microbial life as a catalyst. It was his magnum opus. It would make lithium-ion technology look like the horse and buggy." Dubois stared at her, his mind clearly racing, connecting dots. "Organic power generation. Arthur mentioned something like this to me once, years ago, at a conference in Geneva. He called it his crazy idea. I thought it was just theoretical." "It was," Evelyn said, "until it wasn't. He perfected the catalyst a month before his first heart attack. The research, the formulas, the prototype schematics, they're all in the portfolio. but they aren't labeled revolutionary battery technology. They're buried in his personal research notes, disguised as geological survey data from a field trip we took to Yellowstone Park. He was always paranoid about corporate espionage. Julian Thorne went rigid. He looked at Kenji, a silent, panicked question in his eyes. Kenji could only give a helpless, terrified shrug. They had seen the files labeled Yellowstone Trip, personal, and dismissed them as irrelevant. They had categorized them as noise. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. The unraveling was complete. She hadn't just embarrassed Julian Thorne. She had exposed his entire multi-million-dollar acquisition strategy as a catastrophic failure of due diligence. He wasn't a shark. He was a bottom feeder, sifting through the wreckage for shiny objects, while completely missing the treasure chest buried in the sand. And she had just handed Antoine Dubois the map. Julian Thorne's mind was a frantic whirlwind of denial and damage control. "This is absurd," he blustered, trying to project an aura of command that was rapidly disintegrating. "She's making it up. It's a fantasy, a daughter's grief-stricken delusion. There is no magic battery. If there were, it would be in the engineering logs, not some personal travel journal." Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, her calm a stark contrast to his rising panic. "You think my father, a man who had his last great idea stolen by a rival firm in the 90s, would label his most revolutionary discovery top secret invention? He was smarter than that. He hid it in plain sight. He used the language of geology, stratification, core samples, seismic data, as a cipher for the chemical layers, component parts, and energy output readings of the prototype. You would need to understand both his work and his mind to decode it. Your team, Mr. Thorne, clearly understood neither." Antoine Dubois, the seasoned investor, saw the truth instantly. It was exactly the kind of elegant, paranoid brilliance that a man like Arthur Vance would employ. He looked at Julian, and for the first time, Julian saw not a potential partner, but a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Julian," Dubois said, his voice dangerously soft, "did your team perform a deep forensic analysis of Arthur's personal files, or did they simply scan the documents for keywords related to existing patents?" Julian's silence was his confession. Keyword searches. That's all they had done. The cheap, fast, superficial method. He had been so arrogant, so certain that he was picking over the carcass of a failed company, that he hadn't bothered to look for a hidden heartbeat. "I see," Dubois said, his tone turning to ice. He then turned back to Evelyn, his expression warming again. "Miss Vance, this catalyst you mentioned, what is its primary component?" "That's the beauty of it," Evelyn explained, her passion for her father's work shining through. "It's a genetically modified enzyme derived from extremophile bacteria, the kind found in deep-sea hydrothermal vents. It's incredibly resilient, and once active, it's self-replicating. A single square inch of the material could theoretically power a home for a lifetime. My father called the enzyme Eterna." Dubois nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding on his face. "Eterna," he repeated softly. "Eternal." He looked at Julian, his eyes glinting like chips of granite. "Your Project Nightingale is a fool's errand, Julian. You are planning to pay millions for a library, but you don't even know that a priceless first edition Shakespeare is hidden inside, disguised as a cookbook." The metaphor was devastating. Julian Thorne, the great disruptor, the tech visionary, was exposed as a superficial charlatan. He hadn't done the work. He had taken a shortcut, and now he had driven his entire enterprise into a dead end in front of the one man he needed to impress most. The ultimate outsmarting wasn't the witty comeback in French. It was this, the complete and utter demolition of his business credibility. Evelyn hadn't just won a moral victory, she had inflicted a catastrophic financial and professional wound. She pressed her advantage. The holding company that currently owns the Vance Innovate portfolio, they have no idea what they possess, do they, Mr. Thorne? You offered them, what, $10 million for everything? Julian remained silent, his face a thunderous mask. "I imagine," Evelyn continued, speaking directly to Dubois, "that if someone were to approach them with a superior offer, say $20 million, along with a detailed explanation of what the Yellowstone data actually represents, they would be very interested. especially if that someone came with the backing of a respected investor who understood the technology's true potential. She had just laid out a complete business plan to steal the deal right out from under him, using his own target and his own potential investor. It was a masterstroke of strategic thinking, conceived in the heat of battle on the floor of a restaurant. Julian finally snapped. He threw his napkin onto the table and stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This meeting is over," he seethed, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Antoine, if you choose to believe this fantasy from a broke waitress over the data from my entire analytics division, then you are a bigger fool than I thought." He turned to leave, but Dubois' voice stopped him in his tracks. "Oh, I don't think she is a waitress anymore, Julian," Dubois said calmly, taking a deliberate sip of his scotch. "I believe I am looking at the new CEO of a reborn Vance Innovate. And as for who the fool is, I think that has been made abundantly clear tonight." Julian Thorne didn't look back. He strode out of the restaurant, a defeated king abandoning his own battlefield. Kenji, after a moment of panicked hesitation, scrambled to follow him, leaving a half-eaten dessert and a trail of humiliation in his wake. The table, once a stage for a billionaire's ego, was now quiet. It was just Evelyn and Antoine Dubois, two people connected by the ghost of a brilliant man. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had come home. Dubois looked across the table at Evelyn, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Miss Vance," he said, raising his glass, "it seems we have a great deal to discuss. But first, allow me to apologize for my former associate. His behavior was appalling." Evelyn took a deep breath, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a feeling of clean, clear-eyed vindication. "Don't apologize, Mr. Dubois," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips for the first time all night. "If he hadn't been so arrogant, I never would have gotten the chance to buy my father's company back." The echoing silence left in Julian Thorne's wake was more profound than the preceding confrontation. It was a vacuum, cleared of arrogance and bluster, now waiting to be filled with something new. The air at the table, once thick with tension, seemed to thin, becoming charged with the electric hum of pure possibility. The half-eaten entrees and expensive glasses of scotch sat like relics from a battle that had already been won. For a long moment, Evelyn and Antoine Dubois simply looked at each other. He, the seasoned titan of industry, saw not a waitress, but the resurrection of a brilliant legacy and an unprecedented opportunity. She, the woman who had started her shift dreading a $5,000 debt, saw not an employer or a savior, but a partner, the first person in 2 long years who looked at her and saw the woman she was, not the apron she wore. "Well," Dubois finally said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, breaking the spell. "That was the most expensive and yet most profitable dinner I have had in a very long time." He gestured to the chair Julian had abandoned. "Let us not waste this moment, Evelyn. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Assume I know nothing." What followed was not a simple conversation, but a masterful unfolding. The initial discussion was an interrogation, albeit a polite one. Dubois, the shrewd investor beneath the courtly, old-world demeanor, began to probe. He wasn't just testing her knowledge of the science, he was testing her. "The catalyst, Eterna. You said it's derived from extremophiles," he began, steepling his fingers. "The sourcing for such a material must be extraordinarily difficult and expensive. How did your father overcome that?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. She was no longer Evelyn Vance, server Chonan 12. She was Arthur Vance's daughter, his confidant, his secret apprentice. He solved it. That's the part Thorne's team would never have understood. The initial sample was difficult, yes, from a Pacific hydrothermal vent. But the enzyme's key property isn't just its resilience, it's that it's self-replicating. He developed a synthetic protein substrate in the lab. Once you introduce a single living enzyme, it cultures itself. It grows. He was essentially farming it. The notes on that process aren't in the Yellowstone files. They're cross-referenced in his private horticultural logs under the heading Orchid Propagation. Dubois' eyebrows shot up. The sheer elegant paranoia of it was breathtaking. Arthur Vance had hidden his world-changing invention across multiple, seemingly unrelated disciplines. And scalability, Dubois pressed. A lab prototype is one thing. Mass production is another beast entirely. What were his plans for that? He was already working on it, Evelyn explained, a new energy infusing her voice. She leaned forward, her hands moving as she described the concepts. He called it the BioWeave. Instead of trying to build solid-state batteries, he envisioned a flexible, carbon nanofiber mesh that could be impregnated with the Eterna culture. It could be woven into anything, the lining of a jacket to power a phone, the frame of a car, the walls of a house. The power source becomes part of the structure. It's decentralized, organic, and constantly regenerating. As she spoke, she grabbed a pen from a passing busboy and began sketching on the back of the heavy linen menu. She drew the hexagonal structure of the carbon mesh, the way the enzyme would bond to it, the flow of electrons. Her art history background, which had once felt so frivolous, now revealed its hidden strength. It had taught her to see and communicate complex structures with clarity and elegance. Dubois watched, utterly captivated. He had sat through hundreds of pitches from slick, Stanford-educated CEOs with polished slide decks and rehearsed buzzwords. None of them had possessed a fraction of the raw, authentic brilliance he was witnessing now. This wasn't a pitch. It was a revelation. After nearly 2 hours, with the restaurant staff beginning their quiet, end-of-night rituals around them, Dubois leaned back. The interrogation was over. He was no longer assessing an opportunity. He was planning a revolution. He pulled out his phone, a sleek, unassuming device. He tapped the screen a few times and put it to his ear. "Klaus, wake up. I need you," he said, his voice now crisp and commanding. The European accent was more pronounced. "Yes, I know it is 3 a.m. in Zurich. This is more important than your sleep." Evelyn sat perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. "I am dissolving my position in the Apex Feeder Fund. Effective immediately," Dubois stated into the phone. "Cite a material breach of fiduciary confidence. Julian will understand." There was a pause. "Next, I want you to establish a new holding company. Call it Eterna Innovations. I am wiring an initial seed capital of $50 million from my personal reserve. I want you to draft an offer to acquire the assets of the defunct Vance Innovate portfolio. Offer them $20 million. No, make it 25. I don't want a negotiation. I want a swift execution. And Klaus," he paused again, his eyes meeting Evelyn's across the table, "the paperwork needs to list the president and chief executive officer. Her name is Evelyn Vance. V-A-N-C-E. He listened for another moment, then a small smile played on his lips. "Yes, Arthur's daughter. It's a long story. I will tell you when you are on the jet. I want you in New York by tomorrow evening." He ended the call and placed the phone gently on the table. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. $50 million. President and CEO. Eterna Innovations. The words hung in the air, glittering and terrifyingly real. Is this really happening?" Evelyn whispered, the question feeling small and fragile in the cavernous, empty dining room. "Evelyn," Dubois said, his voice soft but firm, "men like Julian Thorne believe the world is moved by money and aggression. They are wrong. The world is moved by brilliant ideas and by the passionate, dedicated people who bring them to life. Your father had the idea. You hold the key to it. My money is simply a tool to open the door. The rest will be up to you." As they finally stood to leave, Dubois insisted on settling the astronomical bill, leaving a tip so generous it would likely change the fortunes of the entire waitstaff for the month. Evelyn walked toward the back of the house, moving through a world she no longer belonged to. The few staff members still polishing silver or wiping down counters stopped and watched her pass. Their faces held a new expression, not pity or camaraderie, but sheer, unadulterated awe. She was one of them, and she had faced down the dragon and won. In the cramped, humid locker room, she opened the thin metal door to her locker. Inside were the artifacts of her subjugation. The extra apron, neatly folded, a pair of worn-out, comfortable shoes for the long shifts, a half-eaten energy bar, and a dog-eared paperback she read on her breaks. It all seemed to belong to another person, another lifetime. Her fingers found her wallet. She pulled out the collections notice, the paper flimsy and menacing, $5,000. The sum that had been the source of so many sleepless nights, a symbol of her failure and her entrapment. She looked at the bold red letters of Final Notice, and a tear, the first one she had allowed herself all night, traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear, but of catharsis, a final, cleansing release of 2 years of quiet desperation. She didn't rip it up. Instead, she carefully folded it and placed it back in her wallet. It would be the very first bill Eterna Innovations paid, a reminder of where she had come from. Her manager, Robert, was waiting for her by the staff exit, twisting a napkin in his hands. "Miss Vance?" "Evelyn," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw everything. I'm so sorry for how I spoke to you." Evelyn looked at him, at his tired eyes and stressed-out expression. She felt no anger, only a wave of empathy. He was just another person trapped in the system, trying to survive. "You were doing your job, Robert," she said, her voice gentle. She extended a hand. "Thank you for everything. This job, it kept me afloat when I needed it most." He shook her hand, his grip trembling slightly. "If you ever need anything, a recommendation." He trailed off, realizing how absurd that sounded now. She just smiled. "I'll be fine." She stepped out of the service alley into the cool night air. The city smelled of rain and exhaust and possibility. The lights of Columbus Circle, which for 2 years had mocked her from a distance, now seemed to be bowing in welcome. They were no longer the lights of a world that had cast her out. They were the lights of her city, her kingdom, her future. The Blacktown car that Dubois had summoned was waiting at the curb. The driver held the door open for her. As she slid into the plush leather seat, she looked back one last time at the grand entrance of Aurelia. A gilded cage. But sometimes, she realized, a cage is not just a prison. Sometimes it is the crucible where you are forced to forge the key that will set you free. Dubois was already in the car, speaking softly on another call. As the car pulled silently into the flow of New York traffic, he hung up and turned to her. "The board of the holding company has been alerted," he said. "They are intrigued by our offer. Thorne has already called them, trying to poison the well, but his credibility is shot." He paused, studying her face in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. "Your father would be incredibly proud, Evelyn. But this road will not be easy. Men like Thorne do not forget a humiliation like this. They will come for you." Evelyn looked out the window at the towering buildings of steel and glass, at the endless river of headlights. She thought of her father's brilliance, her mother's warmth, and the cold, hard steel that had grown around her own heart during the last 2 years. "Let them come," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the certainty of forged metal. "He thought I was just part of the background noise. He's about to find out I'm the signal." This wasn't just a story about a witty comeback or a bully getting what he deserved. It was a powerful reminder that a person's worth is never defined by their job title, their uniform, or their bank account. Evelyn Vance wore an apron, but she was armed with an education, a legacy, and an unbreakable spirit. Julian Thorne wore a designer suit, but his arrogance was a cheap fabric that tore apart the moment it was tested. He saw a servant. He was blind to the survivor standing right in front of him. This story shows us that true power isn't about humiliating others. It's about the quiet strength you carry inside, the knowledge you've earned, and the dignity you refuse to surrender, no matter the circumstances. What did you think of Evelyn's ultimate revenge? Was it the perfect response to such arrogance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you and you believe in the power of unseen strength, please hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true stories of justice and inspiration. Thank you for listening.